Welcome to FRE Lunch, the official podcast of the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida. I'm Elena Poulin, the Marketing and Communications Specialist for the department.
And I'm Caleb Stair, Assistant Instructional Professor of Food and Resource Economics and the Coordinator for Undergraduate Research in the department, meaning I get to interact regularly with the members of our UF community and see all the cool and interesting topics being explored.
That's why we made this podcast, to showcase the many ways students and faculty are using research to understand and address the complex issues facing agricultural and natural resource industries.
In 2025, there's lots of interesting issues that economics can be applied to, but that's only one faucet of the whole solution.
To get the complete picture on one of these issues, we're teaming up with the UF Water Institute and new co-host Sarah Mark for a deep dive into the fathoms of Florida's fresh water.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mark, the Communications and Events Specialist for the Water Institute. Essentially, we serve as a connector between collaborators across the university and beyond.
From aquifers to agriculture, today's episode is about best management practices for Florida farmers and producers.
That's right. With millions of acres of agriculture in all 67 counties, Florida Food doesn't just feed Floridians, it feeds the world.
But in order to do that, it takes water first and then other inputs like fertilizer to produce and process.
And how do they do that, you ask? Well, they're helped out by the University of Florida's researchers and extension agents, who can inform them on new technologies and provide guidance on their use.
This guidance is known as BMP.
BMP? What does this have to do with heartbeats?
That's BPM, Caleb. We're talking about best management practices. BMP.
Exactly. Anyways, to make sure that we can all be on the same page about this, including Caleb, we're joined today by two experts. Could you both tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Hello, everybody. I'm Jake Capasso. I'm a regional specialized extension agent for water resources working at the North Florida Research Education Center, Suwannee Valley in Live Oak, Florida. I work with farmers primarily on irrigation and nutrient management related issues in Northeast Florida.
And I'm Christa Court. I am an associate professor in the Food and Resource Economics Department and also director of the Economic Impact Analysis Program. My expertise is in regional economic modeling and economic impact analysis. So we do a lot of work trying to figure out how everything within a regional economy is related to everything else.
So how does agriculture, water quality and quantity, and these regulations interact with each other?
So water quality and water quantity, what I think about in Florida for water quality and water quantity when it comes to regulations is first the basin management action plans. So in Florida, we have basin management action plans that are implemented for different pollutants for water bodies.
These management action plans set the limit for things we don't want to see in our water, like pathogens or too much nitrogen.
When it comes to water quantity, it all boils down to minimum flows and limits.
So minimum flows and limits have to do with preserving some of those water resources that we have for the natural environment. So if we're talking about minimum flows and limits for the Ichetucknee Springs, we're talking about keeping that water around for fish habitat, for aquatic vegetation, for hydric soils, or whatever the Florida Department of Environmental Protection deems that water to be used for ecological purposes. But we also need to use water. We need to use water, for our purposes in urban development, having water for drinking water, for showers. We also use it a lot in agriculture, and especially in rural areas, we're the big user of water because irrigation takes a lot of water, especially when it comes to overhead irrigation. So I think about basin management action plans and minimum flows and limits when we think about regulation imposed by the state for water quality and water quantity.
So how do these regulations regarding water quantity and quality impact Florida agriculture? Well, it has to do with the inputs.
Inputs are anything that can be put together to produce an output. For a farmer, this might be rain and seeds and sunlight and fertilizer.
The costs associated with these inputs are a critical consideration for farmers when managing a budget.
Like any other business, farmers have costs related to their work. So we often talk of input goods and services, so things that they need to purchase or services that they need to purchase to make their farm work, but also work in a profitable manner. So think of things like seed. fertilizer, any type of pesticides or herbicides that they may need. In terms of services, they may hire a lawyer or an accountant or any of these other types of services to keep their business running properly. There's also, some of those are imported, some of those come from the local economy. So depending on how those purchases are made, there could be multiplier effects associated with those purchases and other things going on in the local economy.
So we've talked a little bit about the different costs associated with implementing these technologies. Are there any sort of other typical costs that you might associate with either implementing or enforcing these best management practices?
Well, regulation can be negative and be perceived as negative in terms of the agricultural industry, but there are also some positive things about it. For example, if they are enrolled in the Best Management Practices program, which I believe is required if they're located within a Basin Management Action Plan, and encouraged if they're located outside of one, but they have access to agricultural cost share. So having access to agricultural cost share means if they want to get a soil moisture sensor, for example, that may cost them $2,000, but with agricultural cost share in a Basin Management Action Plan, they can get their cost back of around 90%. So it would only really cost them somewhere around $200. And this is true for a whole bunch of other agricultural equipment like side dressing fertilizer rigs, which apply fertilizer more efficiently than broadcasting rigs, for example.
So in terms of costs of implementation, it essentially changes the equation for the farmers when certain behavior or certain practices change their business decision. It's going to impact some of those input costs that we talked about earlier, and they're no longer simply cost minimizing or profit maximizing. They need to take these regulations into account. There's also costs associated with enforcement. So there may be, if you have a new program or an updated program and you need additional, let's say, people to go out and make sure that these activities are happening and best management practices are being followed, that's a cost to the taxpayer. There's also the fact that if there is research that has gone into the development of these best management practices, things change over time. So you're going to need to update that research over time. So there's a cost associated with keeping that updated. The best management practices are the best management practices for now, not for 15, 20 years ago.
And those updates are different depending on where you are, and that's where extension comes in.
So IFAS Extension is basically the wing of the University of Florida that focuses on outreach. I think most undergrads would be familiar with the research that occurs at the University of Florida and the education that occurs at the University of Florida. Well, Extension has to do with getting basically the information at the University of Florida out to the stakeholders. In my case, I work with agricultural producers, so it makes no sense for the University of Florida's researchers just to have new knowledge about agriculture. We want to get that knowledge out to our stakeholders in the state of Florida. And, taxpayers' money helps to support a lot of what we do at the University of Florida, which is a public institution. So we have a duty to do that. University of Florida and FAMU are land-grant universities in the state of Florida. We have a land-grant university in every single state in the country.
As the regional economist, I'm going to add now that it's however many years later since this was implemented, our stakeholders are no longer just the agricultural producers. Extension has a wide variety of programs for all types of audiences because initially when it was developed, agriculture really was the only industry. But now there are so many other things going on. So my own program, I have an integrated extension and research appointment. So our stakeholders are really sort of state level decision makers and making sure that they have all of the information on the economy or the economic impacts that might result from a particular decision when they go to make those decisions.
I think that's really important to add. Traditionally, agriculture was the big focus of extension, and extension is still thought of as being associated with the agricultural industry. When I was a county agent in Columbia County, I worked in an office, and there is a county extension office basically in every single county in the state of Florida, all 67 counties. But I worked in an office with a 4-H agent who did youth development. I worked with a family and consumer sciences agent who did work related to safety in the kitchen in terms of, cooking and, doing canning classes and also doing a lot of tax help for people. I worked with a livestock and natural resource agent who basically made it so I didn't have to worry about the livestock. I just had to worry about the crop production. And then also a horticulture agent as well that did more of the residential horticulture. So extension reaches a lot of different industries, and Columbia County is an example of, a typical extension office, I think, in North Florida. But when you get into bigger counties, you can have a lot of different program areas represented.
Maybe the concept of extension seems a bit abstract if you haven't really interacted with it before. So how about a more concrete example focused in Jay's home region?
So the Suwannee Valley region is located in northeast Florida around the Suwannee River. So when I think about counties in the Suwannee Valley region, I think of Suwannee County, Hamilton County, Columbia County, Gilchrist, Levy, Dixie, the western part of Alachua County. And in this region, we have a lot of watermelon production, field corn production, and peanut production. I'd say those are our three biggest commercial crops. And we also have a lot of cow-calf operations.
This area needs to balance agricultural production with ecotourism.
And we're also, this area, and I guess North Florida in general, it has the highest concentration of freshwater springs in the world. So we have a lot of freshwater springs in my area, mostly associated with the Suwannee rivers and the Santa Fe rivers. So there's a huge focus on balancing, protecting our water resources that help us, attract tourism to the region and support a lot of tourism jobs, but also to protect our farmers and their rural livelihoods, which is also a big industry in the region.
Research seeks to find a middle ground where both groups can be satisfied.
In an ideal world, this means projects that both save farmers money and protect our resources.
So if you are using irrigation more efficiently, then potentially you are lowering costs in areas that are either related to irrigation or you have additional resources available for other things. So I think it could be like any other regulation. If you're implementing a best management practice on farm, sometimes there are costs to do so, but in the long run, maybe it's economically more profitable. But some of the best management practices are saving you money right off the bat.
Do we have any success stories around the use of BMPs?
When it comes to success stories with best management practices, one that I think is really important dates back to the 1980s and 1990s when Bob Hockmuth was working with a lot of watermelon growers, and they would do 10 to 15 farm demos, basically implementing drip irrigation on watermelon, when the big practice at the time was using overhead irrigation. And drip irrigation is much more efficient than overhead irrigation. You're applying water directly to the plant roots. And I think we have a lot of growers that are just irrigating less than they used to in terms of the length of their irrigation events. Back in the day, I don't think it was all that uncommon for growers to irrigate for more than 5 hours for drip irrigation. And now that's pretty rare, I think, in our region.
Just how much more effective is this drip irrigation? Well, according to Jay, the practice has been adopted on over 7,000 acres across the Suwannee Valley region, resulting in about 70% water savings.
New technology continues to evolve, such as the introduction of soil moisture sensors.
With this evolution of technology, extension agents are there to help inform farmers and provide guidance.
So using soil moisture sensors, using technology, but also extension going out on farm and doing demonstration projects, using blue dye, for example. We'll inject blue dye through drip irrigation to show how deep the water and the nutrients will go in the soil profile. And we dig a hole to kind of show how that happens. That's been a famous demonstration that we've done at the North Florida Research Education Center, Suwannee Valley. And the famous line is, the blue dye don't lie. So if you irrigate, whether you put blue dye on the soil surface and did overhead irrigation over it, or you injected it into a drip irrigation system, it's a great visual for farmers to see how deep that irrigation event went. And it really clicks. Soil moisture sensors show growers the same exact thing, but it's a lot of squiggly lines on a computer and more confusing to interpret. So I think there's a visual aspect to that demonstration. So I think a lot of the work that Extension has done and just the implementation of technology in general has resulted in huge gains in efficiency.
In an ideal world, we want all stakeholders involved from start to finish. You may remember Dr. Sadie Hundemer and the Facets project from episode number 2. Link is in the description.
But if you haven't listened to it yet, Facets is the Floridian Aquifer Collaborative Engagement for Sustainability project. This was a multi-year effort led by the UF Water Institute and funded by the United States Department of Agriculture's National Institute of Food and Agriculture.
It was a project that brought scientists and stakeholders together in what we call a participatory research process. So it wasn't just researchers asking a few questions from stakeholders and then going off to their offices and doing their own thing for several years, and then we come back and say, look what we found. It was really integrating the stakeholders, and those stakeholders were farmers as well as representatives of different regulatory agencies in the area. We brought them together to help with assumptions for the modeling, scenarios that we were going to model, helping us understand what goes on the farm so that we model it correctly, different things like that. And it was just a really good way for us to make sure that we were doing things that were not only accurate at the end, but usable for these audiences.
This project was made to involve all stakeholders from start to finish.
One of the things that I really liked was you didn't feel like you were communicating well or that there was a lot of trust between some of the groups at the very beginning of the project. But once we got to know each other, learned how to communicate with one another, not communicating in our research jargon solely, things went really well. In the second half of the project, we understood what we were doing, what the audiences wanted, and how to communicate them. And then the different stakeholders were able to explain our research to others and explain it in a way that their own audiences would understand. And I just thought that that was a very successful way to do research as opposed to me and the economist sitting at my desk and then trying to tell somebody, hey, look what I found at the end.
So we've covered a lot in today's episode. What is one key piece of information that you want our listeners to take away with them?
I guess I'd want them to know that we're making a lot of progress in terms of managing our water resources efficiently and managing our nutrients efficiently as well. And Florida is at the forefront of a lot of this stuff with best management practices compared to other states. So I think there's a huge focus in Florida in protecting, the tourism industry and also protecting the agricultural industry because they're two major industries in the state of Florida. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but we've made a lot of progress.
I'll say that I'll put my researcher hat on to answer this question because Jay mentioned that Florida's at the forefront of a lot of these things and research is often what has gotten us there. But it's this integrated research and extension relationship, I think, that makes that so successful. So I would say if you are listening and you're not affiliated with the university in any way, we want your input throughout the whole research process. And much of that can come through the extension offices, whether that's with a local county office or with some of these regional research and education centers like Jay is with. I would say connect with your local extension folks. There's probably always ways that we are looking for input on research projects, or you can find resources there if you're just looking to maybe implement some of these best management practices the extension office knows about that you don't yet know about, or just learning about the outcomes of new research that we have all the time.
So, to wrap up, environmental management and agriculture go hand in hand.
While it may sometimes seem like these are competing interests, we all want the same thing: clean water and good food.
We hope you enjoyed this episode on BMPs and that it didn't raise your BPMs as much as doing BMX.
And if this episode sparked your curiosity, we encourage you to go out and connect with your local producers, wherever you may be.
You just might be surprised by what you find, and if you're interested in learning more about what we talked about today, check out the links in the description.
If you've made it this far, you've finished the entire episode, and we thank you for that. Tune in next time for more food for thought. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of FRE Lunch. We hope you'll come back again for seconds.